Before countries waged war for oil, they slaughtered millions for something you have in your kitchen, for the vast majority of our past. The world's most sought-after asset was not gold, land, or precious metals. It was flavor. A tiny pile of dried seeds, a sliver of tree bark, a single drop of plant resin. These were the true treasures that forged and shattered entire empires. It seems almost unbelievable now, in an era where we find spices neatly arranged on grocery store aisles. But for nearly a millennium, a pouch of peppercorns was more valuable than a pouch of gold. A bit of nutmeg could secure you a home. Cinnamon might erase a family's entire debt. And the most powerful nations on earth would murder, colonize, and gamble everything for total control over where these tastes originated. Welcome to Winds of Thought, where we explore the hidden currents that shape our world long before the modern era took shape, before the idea of the United States, before 24-hour stock markets, before energy pipelines crisscrossed the globe. The entire world economy turned on the axis of spice. This wasn't merely because they improved the taste of food. It was because they offered solutions to problems that were otherwise unsolvable. Spices kept meat from spoiling. They could sterilize a wound, conceal the stench of decay, help remedy diseases, elevate one's social standing, and project a level of wealth that nothing else could match. In the medieval European context, a meal seasoned with cloves or cinnamon was more than just sustenance. It was a bold declaration that your existence transcended the grim, cold reality of daily survival. In an age defined by scarcity, spices were the closest humanity got to actual magic. And because of this, they became a currency. They became a source of immense power. Imagine Europe during the 12th century. It was cold, isolated, and overwhelmingly bland. The average person rarely ventured more than a few miles from their village. Their food was repetitive. Their winters felt endless. Fresh produce was a rarity. Preserved items tasted of rot and damp cellars. Yet, the aristocracy held extravagant banquets featuring exotic flavors from lands. They could only dream of spices transported on the backs of merchants who had traversed deserts, scaled mountains, and sailed across vast oceans. A single pound of black pepper could be exchanged for a herd of sheep. A small bag of saffron could purchase weapons. These weren't simple indulgences. They were strategic assets, and Europe was desperate to acquire more. But delivering these spices to Europe meant navigating one of the most complex, clandestine, and lucrative supply networks the planet had ever witnessed. Spices did not grow in Europe. Their origins were in the distant corners of the Malabar coast of India, Indonesia's Banda Islands, the highlands of Sri Lanka, and the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. To arrive in Europe, they passed through a carefully orchestrated chain of merchants, from Indian traders to Arab middlemen, from Arab middlemen to Egyptian ports, and from those ports to Venetian galleys. Each transfer added a significant markup. Each participant fiercely guarded its role and its secrets. The farther a spice got from its source, the more fantastical the stories merchants spun to protect their roots. Medieval gossip claimed cinnamon was found in the nests of giant birds guarded by winged serpents. Nutmeg, they said, grew on islands patrolled by dragons. Pepper was supposedly harvested from forests so lethal that workers had to set them ablaze, which is what turned the peppercorns black. These were not harmless fairy tales. They were instruments of primitive corporate misinformation campaigns, intended to preserve a monopoly. And at the very end of this worldwide relay was Venice. The unlikely financial capital of the medieval age, Venice produced no spices. It had no control over their cultivation. What it did control was the ultimate bottleneck, the gateway, where all these goods flowed into the European continent. By the 13th century, Venice had established a virtual monopoly on the import of pepper and other precious spices. Its merchants were the original price manipulators, engineering scarcity, stockpiling goods in their warehouses, and timing shipments to maximize their profits. The immense wealth from this business transformed Venice into a magnificent city of marble palaces, gilded art, and overwhelming naval strength. It was the first state in Europe to grow rich not from agriculture, but from logistics, by mastering the flow of goods instead of owning the fields. This is a model many modern companies still emulate, but dominance always creates desperation. The tighter Venice squeezed its monopoly, the more the rest of Europe frantically searched for a way around it. And this is the point where the story turns westward out, toward the Atlantic, into the great unknown, toward a landmass that would one day be known as the Americas. This wasn't because Europe craved new continents. It wasn't because explorers were driven by a pure love of discovery. Europe sailed west for a single reason: to shatter the spice monopoly. Columbus did not sail across the Atlantic Ocean, seeking a new world. He sailed because he was convinced he could find a faster route to Asia, the land of pepper, by going west. His calculations were wrong, but his historic blunder completely reshaped civilization. Vasco da Gama journeyed around Africa, not for exploration's sake, but to destroy the Arab hold on the trade. Magellan's fleet circumnavigated the planet because Spain desperately needed its own private path to the Spice Islands. Every single voyage that kicked off the so-called Age of Discovery started as a financial calculation to obtain cheaper spices. Empire was a byproduct of profit. Geography was redrawn by greed, and upon reaching the Americas, Europeans stumbled upon something incredible: a second wave of spices, new, powerful, and utterly transformative. Chili peppers, which were entirely unknown in Asia before 1492, spread through the Eastern Hemisphere like wildfire. Within just a few decades, Indian curries, Sichuan cooking, and Korean kimchi were forever changed. Vanilla, a Mesoamerican jewel, rose to become one of the most expensive commodities in Europe. Cacao, once a form of currency in Aztec society, became the luxury drink of choice for the European elite. Allspice, native only to Jamaica and parts of Central America, was prized as a preservative and medicinal component all across Europe. Suddenly, the New World was not just some geographical oddity. It was a brand new economic engine, a second frontier for flavor. And this had profound implications for human history. The Americas, which had been separate from Afro-Eurasian trade for millennia, were now permanently integrated into the global economic system. This fusion of old and new world goods truly marks the beginning of globalization as we know it. But to grasp why American spices were so important, we have to go back a few centuries to the world they were about to append. Before chilies redefined Asian food and vanilla seduced European palates, the world economy was already dominated by a single machine: the medieval spice route. It was a rigidly controlled network where farmers made pennies, middlemen made fortunes, and Venice constructed an empire without a single plantation. This was the system the New World smashed into and ultimately destroyed. The medieval spice route was far more than a trade network. It was the first truly global supply chain. Every stage of the journey was designed for maximum profit, secrecy, and the preservation of power. From the coast of India to the Red Sea to the docks of Venice, spices changed hands dozens of times. But the people involved were not equals. At the source, the farmers received almost nothing. By the time that same peppercorn was served at a banquet in London or Paris, its price had inflated by 100 times or more. It stands as one of history's first and most glaring examples of systemic value extraction. So how did they maintain this? The key players realized that true power didn't come from covering distance, it came from controlling gateways. If you could command a strait, a port, or a thin channel between islands, you commanded the flow of wealth. Arab merchants held sway over the Indian Ocean because they had mastered the monsoon winds and the ports of Aden, Hormuz, and Jeddah. Venice dominated Europe because it controlled the Adriatic Sea and possessed the diplomatic power to secure exclusive trade agreements with Egypt. Venice's small size was irrelevant. What mattered was its position at the end of the funnel. This system functioned perfectly until it broke. Because, like every monopoly in the annals of economics, it created a massive incentive for a bypass. The higher Venice jacked up its prices, the more desperate the rest of Europe became to break the chain. And in the 1400s, that desperation finally galvanized into action. Portugal made the first move. Its rulers weren't motivated by glory or scientific curiosity. They wanted pepper. Pepper was the most traded spice on earth, the lifeblood of European cooking, and the single largest source of profit in medieval trade. If Portugal could just cut out Venicif, it could sail directly to the source, could completely rewrite the global balance of power. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa was a technological breakthrough disguised as a navigational feat. Europeans had never managed to successfully cross the Indian Ocean. But in 1498, da Gama arrived in Calicut, the very center of the spice trade. And what he saw there was infuriating. The spices he thought were protected by myths and monsters were just openly stacked in warehouses, sold cheaply and traded casually. The merchants in India had been selling pepper for centuries. Only Europe that had been living under a manufactured illusion of scarcity. Portugal's reaction was not one of humility. It was one of overwhelming force. Within a few decades, Portuguese fleets blockaded harbors, raided merchant ships, and levied brutal taxes on local traders. Their objective was not to join the spice trade, it was to seize it. They constructed forts along the coasts of Africa, Arabia, and India. They captured strategic gateways like Malacca. They bombarded any city that dared to resist. They remade the Indian Ocean into a militarized zone where every vessel required Portuguese permits to even set sail. But Portugal's empire was too small and overstretched to maintain this system indefinitely. And from the north, a new rival emerged, one with sharper business acumen, deeper pockets, and much less patience: the Dutch Republic of. The 1600s was a tiny nation with an enormous ambition to become the nexus of all global commerce. And spices were the path. But the Dutch had a different strategy. They didn't just want to control ports. They wanted to industrialize control itself. In 1602, they established something the world had never before seen: the Verenigd Oostendisch Company, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC was not a state. It was not a merchant guild. It was a corporation. A corporation with stockholders, dividend payouts, legal personhood, and most importantly, the full authority to wage war. It could broker treaties, construct fortresses, mint its own currency, execute its prisoners, and govern entire territories. It was the first multinational corporation to wield the power of a nation-state, and it grew fantastically wealthy by following one simple principle: monopolize absolutely everything. The VOC set its sights on the Banda Islands, the only place on the entire planet where nutmeg grew naturally. Nutmeg was among Europe's most desired spices, believed to possess medicinal qualities that could cure the plague, digestive issues, and even sleeplessness. Controlling nutmeg meant controlling one of the highest margin goods in history. The VOC's method was savage. They massacred the local populations, enslaved the survivors, repopulated the islands with an imported labor force that could be easily managed. Then they imposed a draconian monopoly. Every single nutmeg tree, every shipment, every seed was now company property. This was no longer trade. It was pure extraction. Power wasn't grown in fields. It was forged in boardrooms. And it made Amsterdam the financial capital of the world. The VOC paid out huge dividends, drew in investors from across the globe, and its shares were traded on the planet's first ever stock exchange. This was the birth of modern finance, bankrolled by spices and enforced with violence. Meanwhile, England was watching and taking notes. The English East India Company quickly emulated the same model. It conquered Bengal, manipulated Indian princes, and used its territorial dominance to control the trade of tea, textiles, and spices. In due course, the company ceased to serve the British Empire. It became the British Empire's primary engine. The company printed its own money. It raised its own private armies. At its zenith, it commanded more soldiers than the British Crown itself. And it deployed those soldiers to protect trade routes with the same aggression. Its modern corporations used to protect patents. But the era of cloves and nutmeg had an unexpected result. It built the very infrastructure that would later be used to exploit entirely new kinds of commodities. And once that machinery was in place, the world didn't just use it, it scaled it up massively by the 1700s. The spice trade had so completely redrawn the map that the globe was now running on a new economic principle: whoever commanded the commodities commanded destiny. And no commodity demonstrated this more swiftly than sugar. Sugar was the first product the world craved with a modern, addictive intensity, offering cheap calories, rapid profits, and seemingly limitless demand. European consumption exploded, creating what historians refer to as the first mass consumer good. But if sugar was the new fuel, forced labor was the engine. Plantations became industrial-scale machines, the closest thing the early modern world had to factories. European powers went to war over Caribbean islands, not for territory, but for monopoly control. Jamaica, Barbados, Saint-Domingue, their entire economic worth was tied to a crop that could be converted into cash faster than any other product of the time. And out of this brutal system, unbelievable fortunes were born. And unlike nutmeg or cloves, sugar wasn't confined to tiny remote islands. It grew exceptionally well throughout the Caribbean and coastal Brazil. The center of global wealth began to shift dramatically westward. Sugar didn't just enrich Europe, it generated an economic pull so powerful that the entire Atlantic world started to revolve around it. European merchant families constructed mansions, founded banks, and launched political careers on the wealth extracted from these plantations. Cities like London, Bristol, Amsterdam, and Nantes ballooned in size. Port infrastructure, insurance, firms, and early investment banks all sprouted from this trade. The global financial system was being quietly assembled on the back of a commodity that demanded vast networks, swift shipping, an immense capital, the very same pillars that support global markets today. And here is where the Americas enter. The story of the first global economy in a way many people fail to appreciate. While Eurasian spices had constructed the machinery for global trade, American products transformed that machinery into a self-sustaining cycle. Sugar for Europe's insatiable demand, silver from Mexico and Peru to pay for goods in Asian markets. Tobacco for the continent's booming new consumer base. The New World wasn't just a destination, it became the critical hinge. A pivot connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia into a single, cohesive economic orbit. When Alexander Hamilton later argued for the United States to build its financial power on strong banks, manufacturing, and international trade, he wasn't inventing a system from nothing. He was simply plugging a new nation into a worldwide network that was already operating. A network founded on monopolies, commodity flows, corporate power patterns that started with pepper and cinnamon and grew into something vastly more complex. And yet, for all the glamour of riches crossing oceans, the structure of this system was brutally straightforward. Every empire's goal was to eliminate the middleman. Venice attempted it. Portugal attempted it. The Dutch perfected it. England scaled it. And the Americas provided the final piece in a chain that made the entire world interdependent for the very first time. But the more connected the world became, the more volatile it became. The prices of commodities fluctuated wildly. Wars were fought not over ideology, but over nutmeg groves and sugar refineries. European governments fell deep into debt to finance their fleets and fortresses. Corporations assumed powers that no private company should ever possess. And by the late 1700s, the logic of the global economy had become sentient governments were now reacting to market forces, not the other way around. That fundamental shift created the blueprint for how capitalism operates today. A system where commodities dictate the pace, corporations write the rules, and governments play the game. Financial markets react instantly to faraway shocks, and nations now compete over supply chains they can't fully control. What makes this chapter of history so urgent right now is not the violence, the greed, or even the ambition, it's the underlying pattern. In every single era, the world's most powerful players have employed the same strategy: control the origins, control the roots, and control the information. They didn't simply trade products. They engineered scarcity. They manipulated perception. They manufactured demand. If medieval Venice controlled a sea lane, modern corporations controlled data centers. If the Dutch East India Company monopolized spices, today's tech giants monopolize software, logistics, and cloud services. The instruments have evolved. The logic is identical. And the ultimate irony is that the first global economy was not founded on stability, it was founded on friction. The more difficult it was to get a commodity, the more valuable it became. Pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, sugar, their true power was never their flavor. It was their leverage. They granted small nations the capacity to act like empires and gave corporations the license to behave like governments. When we observe today's financial landscape, with its delicate supply lines, rivalries over resources, and conflicts over rare earth minerals and digital monopolies, the parallels are impossible to ignore. The world is once again structured around strategic gateways, semiconductor foundries, shipping canals, cobalt mines, cloud servers, and satellite networks. And just like the spice networks of the past, they are all in the hands of a few key players who know that access is the ultimate power. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes with an alarming clarity. The first global economy taught humanity that wealth always follows those who master the bottlenecks. And whether the commodity is pepper or data, the rule has never changed. Control the path, and you control the world. If this gave you a new way to see the world, please hit the like button for the algorithm. And for more stories like this, be sure to follow Winds of Thought. We'll show you where to look for the answers history has already given us.